Hello, and the present video is a section of the series of videos that I have done on what would revolution look like in Sweden. And in this video, it's going to be the second installment of the Marxist workers' revolution subset of it, right? Because I consider what a revolution would look like in Sweden from three different perspectives. The perspective of anarcho-capitalism, for which I did 3 videos, the perspective of radical ecology, for which I did 1 video, and then the perspective of dissident Marxism / Trotskyism, which is really 2 videos, and then a third video, which is an appendix, which talks about the Kazakhstan revolution of 2022, right? But in this article, I am going to be reviewing an article that appears in MARXIST.com, which is the main international Marxist tendency website, Marxist.com, in defense of Marxism. And in that website, okay, the international Marxist tendency is one of 3 Trotskyist tendencies in existence today. There are only 3 Trotskyist, organized Trotskyist efforts in existence today in 2022, right? Only 3. 2 orthodox and 1 revisionist. So the 2 orthodox are the international Marxist tendency, which is the largest on the ground. The second one is International Committee of the Fourth International, which publishes the World Socialist website. And then the third one is the revisionist tendency of the Socialist Workers' Party UK, right? So international Marxist tendency is the Grant Woods tendency, and they're orthodox Trotskyist. International Committee of the Fourth International / World Socialist website is the North tendency, and they are also orthodox. And then you have socialistworker.co.uk, which is the Socialist Workers' Party of Britain, and they're the Cliff Kalinikos tendency, and they're revisionist, right? So those are the 3 tendencies of Trotskyism of consequence today. In this video, I am going to focus on the perspective of the Grant Woods tendency, right? Grant and Kalinikos would not agree at all. So yeah. Anyways, so I'm just gonna go over the article, quote, "How to Organize a Revolution," right? And the article, proper title of the article is "The Class, the Party, and the Leadership: How to Organize a Revolution," right? So I took some notes, and I'm just gonna go. The article is pretty long, but so what I did is I took some notes, and I'm gonna go over the notes, right? I'm gonna read the notes that I took from the article and then comment, and we'll do it that way. So, quote, "Socialist ideas are making a comeback. This year, the Victims of Communism Foundation, which cannot be accused of a favorable bias towards Marxism, released its annual survey and found that 49% of 16 to 23-year-olds, Generation Z, have a favorable view of socialism, up 9 points from 2019. Among Americans as a whole, that number has risen from 36% to 40%, end quote. So yeah, I mean, there is an interest in the ideas of socialism, among youth and whatever. Yeah, I mean, a lot of that has to do maybe in the post-Occupy era, Yeah. The problem is, though, that when young people are interested in socialism, there are various concepts of what socialism is. The specific type of concept of socialism that I'm interested in is the Trotskyist version. Okay. And I've already said the 3 tendencies of Trotskyism in existence today. So when I say when I consider the term socialism, I think of international Marxist tendency, International Committee of the Fourth International, and international socialist tendency, which is the Kalinikos revisionist tendency. Okay, those are the 3 that I think when I think of socialism, which would be the revolutionary socialism, not the Bernie Sanders type so-called socialism, which is really a completely mistaken set of ideas. I mean, Bernie Sanders is a liberal Democrat at most. He's not a socialist. He's not a legitimate socialist. Bernie Sanders is, in fact, Bernie Sanders is a con man. He is not a real socialist, because the welfare state is not socialism. Sweden is not socialist. So he claims that he sees Sweden as a model. Sweden is not socialist. Sweden is by no means socialist. The welfare state is not socialism. For legitimate socialism, you need a working class in power. Socialism is a political economy, a political economic concept, which is integral. It is not, just the welfare state and some, fringe benefits or whatever, like free healthcare and education. That's not socialism. And another problem with Bernie Sanders is that Bernie Sanders is actually a creature of the Democratic Party. The aim of Bernie Sanders is to serve as a bait and switch agent, right? He will go up and talk socialism as he understands it, which is the welfare state, which is not socialism, but he'll talk about the welfare state, right? And then people who are like socialist minded or not socialist minded, or who might be interested in the word socialism, because in the media, Bernie Sanders is deliberately associated with socialism. People go to him, as a reference point. In fact, he's a bait and switch con man, because all those people that are interested in Bernie Sanders end up voting for the Democrat Party, whose leader, one of his leaders, Nancy Pelosi, publicly said, we are capitalist. So, and the Democrat Party in the United States is by no means a socialist organization. It's an anti-left organization. So, yeah. So, Bernie Sanders will, get people to vote for him during the primaries, and then during the main election, he will switch and tell you to vote for the Democrat candidate. And what Bernie Sanders is doing is basically he's supplanting the space once occupied by Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader was the real thing. Ralph Nader was not a socialist. He was a reformist. But, he ran an independent campaign to the left of the Democrats in opposition to the Democrats. So the Democrat Party does not want the reemergence of somebody like Ralph Nader ever again. So they manufactured Bernie Sanders to supplant that space and to redirect interest for somebody who would be in that space towards the Democrat Party. So, Bernie Sanders is a bait and switch con man. He's not a legitimate socialist. He's a fraud. If you want real socialism in the United States, you go to Socialist Revolution, which is the international Marxist tendency branch in the United States, or you go to the World Socialist website and talk to a guy named, I think his name is Eric London. He's based in Detroit, and he's like a big promoter of the International Committee for the International. I think he's an immigration attorney. I hope his name is Eric London. I think it is. But yeah, look him up in the World Socialist website if you're interested in American legitimate. If you're interested in legitimate American socialist perspectives, look up either Socialist Revolution, which is the IMT, or look up Eric London, who is the ICFI. Okay. Anyhow, yeah. Another comment I want to make is this Victims of Communism Foundation name. Victims of Communism Foundation. I think what they really mean is victims of Stalinism. Okay. Because communism has never existed. And yeah, the victims of Stalinism, the Stalin dictatorship, were 7 million Ukrainians who died during the, who were starved to death as a result of forced collectivization in the Ukraine. I think the Ukrainians call it the Holodomor, which is like the name they give to that episode. And then there were 3 million Communist Party of the Soviet Union members purged between 1936 and 1938, right? And those Communist Party of the Soviet Union members who were purged between 1936 and 1938, the time of the trials, the show trials and stuff, a lot of those people were dissident Marxists. A lot of those people were supporters of Leon Trotsky. A lot of those people were supporters of, the Amsterdam International, and they were purged. A lot of them were like, elements of the Soviet bureaucracy, such as Ignaz Reis, who were critical of Stalin. Like all those people were purged. About 3 million people, dissident Marxists mostly, were purged by the Stalin regime. And then there were 750,000 members of the Red Army executed for treason. And that included most of the officer corps of the Red Army, was executed for treason. So what happened is when Hitler invaded in 1941, there were no officers, competent officers, to man the Red Army, and that was one of the reasons why the Germans made such a rapid advance between June and October of 1941, is because the officer corps in the Red Army had been decimated by the Stalinist purges. So yeah. And I want to stress again the systematic persecution and murder of dissident Marxists such as Leon Trotsky and Andres Nin, who were targeted by the NKVD. So again, victims of communism, I would say victims of the Stalin regime. But yeah. And I wrote here as a note, if you are critical of the victims of Stalinism, you must also be critical of the victims of Nazism, which included 6 to 8 million dead in the Holocaust and 50 million killed in World War II, and the victims of Western imperialism, such as the genocide of Native Americans and the slave trade. So if you're going to denounce the victims of communism, then you need to denounce the victims of Nazism and the victims of American imperialism. The genocide of Native Americans and the slave trade. That's what I think. Yeah. But yeah, the Stalin regime did murder a lot of people. That's true. Quote, the younger generation in particular has experienced nothing but austerity, declining living standards, terrorism, imperialist interventions, and environmental destruction. Right. That's why Generation Z is interested in the ideas of socialism, maybe. Or some sort of radical ideology. Like a lot of them might also be interested in other radical ideologies like Extinction Rebellion or anarcho-capitalism. It's a reaction against declining living standards, terrorism, imperialist interventions, austerity, and environmental destruction. Right? It is certainly not because the objective conditions to build a socialist society based on superabundance are lacking. There is no doubt that from the economic point of view, all the conditions are there to satisfy human needs. We have the means to feed the entire human population. The technology and knowledge exist to produce the necessities of life in harmony with nature. Large companies like Amazon and Walmart show that it is possible to organize production and distribution on a global scale. Many difficult and dangerous jobs could be replaced by machines. Okay, so let's unpack this. First of all, socialist society based on superabundance. Okay, now, and of course people scoff at this. Oh no, look at the Soviet Union. I mean, look at the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. Their economic systems did not work. I mean, the Soviet agriculture was a fiasco. They could never grow any crops. Soviet agriculture was a complete and total fiasco, disaster. I mean, they had to import grain, to feed the population and use, revenue derived from oil exports to buy grain. That's how the Soviet Union fed its people. And that's why in the Soviet Union, all you could find was bread, right? What Trotskyists say is, first of all, and you have to read The Revolution Betrayed by Leon Trotsky to get this point. The Soviet Union, the economic system in the Soviet Union was not socialism. Okay, yes, it was based on state ownership of the means of production, but the working class was marginalized. The working class was not the administrative entity that ran the nationalized property. It was bureaucrats. And bureaucrats are inefficient and ineffective, and that's what happened. Part of the reason why the Soviet economic system, which was called Gosplan, failed, because it was run by bureaucrats. That's what Trotskyists would say. So that's why the ideal of superabundance was never achieved in the Soviet Union. And the ideal is the ideal of communism in theory is simply to create the material basis that would allow for everyone to have absolute freedom. The material basis, because freedom has to have an economic basis, right? As Karl Marx said, before you can engage in politics, religion, or philosophy, you have to have food, housing, and clothing, right? So you create the material basis where everybody has all their economic needs met, and then on that basis, then you can develop, then people will develop in freedom, right? Then you can have freedom, as much freedom as possible. The state would wither away because laws will no longer be necessary. In theory, that is the goal of communism, right? Obviously, that was never achieved in the Soviet Union by any means, or anywhere in the Eastern Bloc. I mean, the Soviet Union was a police state where there was no freedom, and it was economic scarcity, administered by the bureaucracy, the police state, and the scarcity administered by bureaucracy. That was the Soviet Union. So, yeah. But yeah, no, Trotskyists say, for legitimate communism to be a result, the working class needs to be in power, not just politically, but also in control of the means of production directly. In other words, workers control their workplaces, which was never the case in the Soviet Union or anywhere in the Eastern Bloc, not even Yugoslavia or East Germany, Cuba, none of them. Yeah. Right, and this idea that many dangerous. Okay, no, I want to talk something else. Here. We have the means to feed the entire human population. The technology and knowledge exist to produce the necessities of life in harmony with nature. Right. So the Trotskyist argument is that there is a technology, and the technology the knowledge exists to produce the necessities of life for everyone. If you were to organize, and they say you need a globally, rationally planned economy for that. Yeah, rationally planned economy. And of course, anarcho-capitalists will completely and totally disagree with the idea of a planned economy. They would disagree absolutely, completely with this, all right? And that's fine. Yeah, this issue of many difficult or dangerous jobs could be replaced by machines. Yeah, the way that because the ideal of socialism will be to, reduce the work day to 4 hours per day, right? From 8 hours to 4 hours per day. And the way that you do that is you deploy technology, machines, maximize the use of machines and technology to make it possible for workers only to work 4 hours a day. Now, workers will not be fired or replaced by machines. No, workers will retain their job. It's just that their level of pay will not change, and their job will not change. It's just that it will be reduced from 8 to 4 hours. And also, by reducing the time from 8 to 4 hours, you help eliminate unemployment, Trotskyists argue. So, yeah. It is the working class that can lead the struggle to establish a socialist society by taking control of the means of production. Okay, and this is a key concept of Trotskyism. The working class establishes a socialist society by taking control of the means of production. And I've talked about this in other videos, in a previous video about this workers' revolution, that the workers' revolution really begins not with the seizure of power. The workers' revolution really begins when the workers seize their workplace, right? When the factory workers seize the factory, physically seize the means of production, throw away the manager, throw away the foreman, and throw away the owner, right? So it is the workers expropriate the owner of the factory. But it's not a government decree that does it, but the workers themselves, when they physically seize the means of production, right? And then proceed to organize production without the managers or the capitalist owner or the capitalist. Well, capitalist, it could be a fascist, it could be another regime. But I'm going to try to not use the word capitalist, because my anarcho-capitalist friends say that what we think is capitalism is not really capitalism, and I'm respectful of that. But let's just say, anyways, the Trotskyist conception of socialism is that the workers seize the means of production. Okay, I mean that they engage in a series of wildcat strikes, illegal strikes, out of the control of the social democrat labor bureaucrats is something different. They can do that in order to paralyze the existing state, and then create the space so that then out of this network of workplaces that were seized by the workers, then those workplaces which are under the control of the workers then elect representatives to another body, which is called the Soviet or the Council of Workers, and then that Council of Workers exercises political power. That is the theory, of legitimate socialism. That's legitimate socialism. That's legitimate revolutionary socialism. That is legitimate Marxism, not Bernie Sanders or the Social Democrats or the Swedish Left Party. That's not legitimate socialism, leftism, Marxism. Well, the Swedish Social Democrats are anti-Marxist and whatever. I'm going to leave the Social Democrats out. Social Democrats in Sweden long ago ceased to have any association with socialism. I'm going to leave them out. The Left Party. They claim to be leftist and so whatever. So they're not. They're not, because their perspective is parliamentary cretinism. They're trapped in the parliament. They believe that all you have to do is vote for them, and then they will supposedly legislate communism into existence out of the capitalist parliament. Which is the premise of Santiago Carrillo, who is their theoretical precursor back in the 70s. I'm sure there was a Swede that took up those ideas and formulated them using Swedish language and Swedish perspectives or whatever. But the idea of Carrillismo is that that you take over the parliament and then you legislate communism. The Left Party is never going to do that. It's never going to happen. Because you cannot take over the capitalist parliament and then legislate communism into existence. It's ridiculous, the Left Party. So what the reality is that the Left Party is simply, it's like Bernie Sanders. It's a bait and switch con operation. They're bait and switch con men pretending to be leftist, when in fact they're social democrats. Because once in the parliament, the Left Party, they vote for the social democrats, they support the social democrat. And the social democrats are neoliberal. They're not really socialists. They're anti-socialist, anti-Marxist, anti-revolutionary. They're liberals, social liberals. So the Left Party serves the agenda of social liberalism by supporting the social democrats. They're bait and switch con men. They're not legitimate leftists. The real socialism is what I just described. Workers taking control of the means of production directly. Workers engage in wildcat illegal strikes. Workers then forming councils of workers that exercise political power. In a previous video, I explained dual power, right? The workers create a counter state that challenges the power of the existing state, and that counter state organizes a militia that counters the police of the existing state. Then you have two bodies of armed men confronted with each other, and because the state is bodies of armed men. So that's the Marxist perspective. It's nothing to do with Bernie Sanders or the Left Party, absolutely nothing to do with those people. If you really want Marxist perspectives, legitimate, look, if you are an anarcho-capitalist and you want to criticize Marxism, please stop criticizing the Left Party and Bernie Sanders and criticize the Marxism of the real Marxists, which are the Trotskyists, okay? Whatever. And if you're a Trotskyist, if you're a member of the International Marxist Tendency or the International Committee for International Socialist Tendency, if you're a member of one of these three Trotskyist tendencies and you want to criticize capitalism, criticize Murray Rothbard, okay? Or whatever. Not Milton Friedman. Or no, do criticize Milton Friedman and Margaret Thatcher, but really the one you should be criticizing is Murray Rothbard. Criticize the legitimate thing. The legitimate capitalists are the anarcho-capitalists, and the legitimate Marxists are the Trotskyists. If you're one or the other and you want to criticize somebody, criticize the real thing, not the fakes. Okay. Anyway, that's enough of a rant. In the class, the party, and the leadership, Trotsky opens with a polemic against an allegedly Marxist journal, Que Faire. In one article, Que Faire explained the defeat of the Spanish Revolution by the immaturity of the working class. The working class was allegedly too weak. And then the article makes this comment. So Trotsky disagreed with the editors of Que Faire that the Spanish Revolution was defeated by the so-called immaturity of the working class, right? Trotsky doesn't see that. He says that's not the case, and he points to Catalonia. The workers took control over the workplaces. The peasants seized the land. They formed agricultural collectives. Collectivized workplaces. The telephones changed, the trains, the trams, everything was taken over by the workers. In revolutionary Barcelona, George Orwell wrote about in Homage to Catalonia. When he visited Barcelona and saw the workers in power. George Orwell wrote a book about that, Homage to Catalonia. So The working class was not immature. I mean, look at all they accomplished when they took over, everything in Catalonia. So yeah, so that's what Trotsky criticizes. Yeah, this idea that when the worker sees their workplace, they're immature is simply a social democrat idea, because social democrats say that mature socialism is when you're electoral, right, and realistic, meaning that you have to compromise with capitalism. So that's what Trotsky is criticizing. And then the article talks about Venezuela. Quote, this was one of the explanations of some leftists for the failure to complete the Venezuelan revolution, the Bolivarian revolution, which has been ongoing since the early 2000s. Despite a historic mobilization during the 2002 coup, despite repeatedly voting for Hugo Chávez's Socialist Party, PSUV, despite workers taking control of their workplaces, there are still people who say the Venezuelan working class is too weak. Okay, and I disagree with the international Marxist tendency on this Venezuela thing. The Venezuela thing, okay, maybe this article was written at a time when people still had illusions in the Maduro regime, but just to do it justice, very recently, as recent as 2021, I've heard a comrade from the international Marxist tendency criticizing the Maduro diet. And the Maduro diet is that people in Venezuela can only afford to eat lentils and rice, right? Under Maduro. The Maduro diet, they call it, basically like one step away from starvation. And I've heard members of the international Marxist tendency criticize this very recently. So just to do justice. But when this article was written, though, okay, let's just unpack what they say about Venezuela, the Bolivarian Revolution. And I was a supporter of the Bolivarian Revolution. I was a strong supporter of the Bolivarian Revolution between 1998 and 2013. Okay, in terms of the United States, I supported Ralph Nader. I followed the work of Ralph Nader. Between 1996 and 2004. I followed the work of Ralph Nader, but in terms of revolutionary stuff and revolutionary politics, I followed Hugo Chávez's revolution between 1998 and 2013 when he died, right? After 2013, I consider that the Bolivarian Revolution ended in 2013, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Okay, this idea that the Bolivarian Revolution has been ongoing since the early 2000s, implying that it is ongoing on now. The Bolivarian Revolution ended when Hugo Chávez died, okay? The Bolivarian Revolution ended in 2013. After 2013, you have the Maduro regime, okay? And the material basis for the Maduro regime is the collapse of the oil prices, the global oil prices in 2014, okay? Because when that happened, when the oil prices collapsed, Venezuelan state revenue collapsed with it. So the Maduro regime, in order to cut costs, which he had to do, drastically cut costs, he did two things. One, he dismantled all the social programs and initiatives started by Hugo Chávez, because Hugo Chávez's premise is that he would use oil revenue to fund, the construction of Venezuelan socialism, whatever. I think that was a mistake, but whatever. So when the oil revenue collapsed, the Maduro regime had no means to continue the social programs and initiatives of the revolution. So, the Maduro regime dismantled everything. All the misiones, all the subsidies that went to workplaces that were seized by the workers, all these initiatives to fund women, who wanted to start their own business, all these things that Hugo Chávez was doing. The Bolivarian university system and all these other things that Hugo Chávez funded with oil money, Maduro defunded because he had no money to pay for them, so he dismantled them. And then Maduro engaged in quantitative easing, in order to offset the collapse in Venezuelan oil revenue, in Venezuelan state revenue. He implemented a policy of quantitative easing, in a third world country. Imagine that. Where the oil revenue had collapsed, because the global oil prices plummeted, and he went ahead and installed this quantitative easing policy, which he ordered the central bank to electronically manufacture millions of bolivares fuertes, which the Bolivar fuerte, it means strong Bolivar, became a misnomer, a contradiction in terms. Instead of being the Bolivar fuerte, it became the weaker and weaker and weaker Bolivar. That created the conditions. And what he did is he used this money that he manufactured electronically to fund, the Venezuelan state for as long as he could. And then what happened is that hyperinflation hit in 2015 and 2016. Like that model only worked for like a year, and in 2016, boom, hyperinflation hit. And the hyperinflation in Venezuela is legendary. It's much, much worse than the German hyperinflation that put Hitler in power. Partly, it is far worse than the hyperinflation that existed under Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Far worse. So the Bolivarian Revolution ended in 2013. I just want to make that clear. And technically, the Bolivarian Revolution, the revolutionary process, happened between April 2002 and March 2013. Okay. April 2002 is when you had the counter coup, where there was a popular mobilization, a massive popular mobilization against the coup government of Pedro Carmona. That was the revolution. So, anyhow. And then they talk about Greece in the article. Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister in the 2015 Syriza government, so-called coalition of the radical left, another fraud, is another example of this trend. In a 2013 article amusingly titled Confessions of an Erratic Marxist, he explained that the crisis in Europe is, quote, pregnant not with a progressive alternative, but with radically regressive forces, end quote. He was saying this just as the Greek working class had staged 30 general strikes since 2008. Having no confidence in the working class and seeing only the possibility of regression, he claimed that the only option was to create a broad coalition, including right-wingers, in order to save the European Union and save capitalism from itself. Total disaster, total confusion here. Yanis Varoufakis, Syriza is a complete fraud, much worse than Bernie Sanders, the Swedish Left Party, far worse, because the Coalition for the Radical Left, they presented themselves as, a radical left to the public that had participated in the 30 general strikes since 2008, and then once in power, they stabbed the people who voted for them in the back. Like, for example, when there was that referendum, and people voted OXI, I think, OXI, right? That you wanted out of the European Union or whatever. Not out of the European Union, but rejecting the imposition of drastic austerity by the European Union. And, the Syriza government ignored the popular mandate. They had a mandate from the people. They could have exited the European Union, but they didn't. And gone the road of Hugo Chavez, turned Greece into a version of Venezuela where they went independent from European imperialism or German imperialism or whatever. But they didn't, Instead, Syriza capitulated to the European Union. So, So, and this Yanis Varoufakis was the Greek finance minister at that time. I think he got fired after a year or so. But, because, he was too, honest maybe or whatever. And maybe he saw what was really happening, and whatever. But this idea that you can create a broad coalition, including this idea that the only movement that is up and coming is radically regressive forces, and I think he means the populist far right, right? Like in Sweden, it would be the Swedish Democrats, which in other videos I've called right wing, wrong bird. Those people are they have support. Sure, the populist far right has support, but you know what? They've reached a plateau. They haven't really taken power. In some countries they took power for a while, but then they fell apart, and they haven't really they haven't really achieved the goal of dismantling the European Union, which is the goal of the populist far right. The European Union is never going to allow itself to be dismantled by the populist far right. They're never going to allow the populist far right to have the kind of clout that would let them do that. because the European Union is about business, about banking interests, you know, and those banking interests, especially the German ones, are not going to allow the populist far right to like dismantle a situation that is greatly profitable to them. So the populist far right has no objective future. They might have like some sway local in some elections sometime, but not. They're never going to achieve their goal. Yeah, and Brexit happened. The Brexit thing happened because, you know, that was an exception. I would say Brexit was an exception. They accomplished Brexit. They did take Britain out of the European Union, you know, and they did it in coalition with the far left, with some elements of the far left. Yeah. So I guess that's what Yanis Varoufakis is meaning here. This like a broad coalition including right wingers. I guess he means like the kind of coalition that brought down, that took Britain out of the European Union, right? During the Brexit referendum, it was the, you know, the people who wanted to leave won, and they were led, of course, by the UK Independence Party, but also by people like George Galloway on the left. So, you know, they were like left and right together, work together to take out Britain out of the European Union. I guess that's what he means, but I don't believe in that right left lash shop. And this is what I wrote about that. A coalition of radical ecologists, anarcho-capitalists, and Trotskyists, left communists would be impossible. If you put them in the same room, they would murder each other. Anarcho-capitalists are religiously anti-left, and Trotskyists and left communists are radically anti-capitalist. Radical ecology is anti-political and anti-industrial. There is an entire school of left anarchist theory dedicated to the denial that anarcho-capitalists are real anarchists. So, I mean, there's this idea, it would be impossible to have, you know, a coalition of these people together. Impossible. It wouldn't work. You know, and this is what the article says. The article criticizes Yanis Varoufakis' proposal for a broad coalition including right wingers, and the article says, in defense of Marxism, which is Marxist.com, they say, the reality is that if groups unite without really agreeing, it is a recipe for paralysis. Theoretical differences will come out on every important issue, and the united organization will not be able to move forward. A kayak with two people rowing in opposite directions will turn in circles, while a single person in a kayak will move forward. In other words, you cannot have an organization that has as a goal anarcho-capitalism, worker socialism, and radical ecology. You can't. You know, that would be like, you know, International Marxist Tendency, Extinction Rebellion, and the Mises Institute joining together. That wouldn't work. Impossible, because the Mises Institute has as a goal anarcho-capitalism, which is diametrically opposed to the goal of, the Trotskyists, which is a workers' revolution and workers' power. And then the radical ecologists reject both of those options because they're anti-industrial and anti-political. So it's impossible. You know, it would be impossible to have a coalition of of people who want to overthrow the system, you know, together. Not really. Anyhow, it is not true that the working class is too weak to overthrow capitalism. The reality is that on countless occasions over the last 100 years, workers have risen up to overthrow their exploiters and change society. They've done everything in their power to do so on multiple occasions. Right. So, yeah. And, revolutions, if you look at history, there's plenty of evidence of revolutions happening. The latest revolution was in Kazakhstan just right now in 2022. Before that you had Sudan in 2019, yeah. I mean, revolution is, there has been a couple of recent revolutions, Sudan and Kazakhstan, so, yeah. It was the leaders of the workers' movement, either of the unions or the workers' parties, who put a stop to the movement. They made compromises with the capitalist class rather than trying to take power. And that was the case of the Second International, right? Syriza, that describes Syriza, Instead of leading the working class to power, Syriza made a compromise with the capitalist class, the European Union. And again, I shy away from this capitalist class language, but whatever. Whether the European Union is really capitalist or not is debatable. I think it's a controlled market. But anyhow, they mean the ruling class of the European Union when they say the capitalist class. Okay, Syriza, instead of putting the Greek workers in power in Greece, made a compromise with the ruling class of the European Union, which is basically the political representatives of the German bankers, which is the German government. So, yeah. There are critical moments in history when the masses enter into struggle, revolutions. And yeah, and I was thinking when I read this quote, you know, there are critical moments in history when the masses enter into struggle, and these are called revolutions. And I was thinking of the radical phase of the French Revolution under Maximilien Robespierre during the so-called Reign of Terror, 1792 to 1794. I think that Reign of Terror language was really, you know, concocted by their enemies. You know, I don't think they called it the Reign of Terror or whatever, or maybe they did, but I don't think. Yeah, I don't know. Anyways, the radical phase of the French Revolution under Maximilien Robespierre between 1793 and 1794. That would be the rule of the Committee of Public Safety, and I've, you know, used language, Committee of Public Safety language in other videos here about this issue of revolution in Sweden. But you know, another example of the masses entering into struggle would be the Sandinista Revolution of 1979 to 1983. The radical phase of the Sandinista Revolution between 1979 and 1983, which was the only successful example of an urban guerrilla movement gaining mass popular support in the form of strikes and mass youth protests. So, you know, how the Sandinistas overthrew the Somoza regime was, you know, of course, the workers engaged in massive strikes, you know, illegal strikes, because obviously striking was illegal or whatever. And under Somoza, they struck anyways. The workers defied the regime and its anti-strike laws and struck anyways. Staged massive wildcat strikes, and at the same time, the students rose up. You know, the student movement rose up. The Sandinista-minded student movements rose up, and you know, there's scenes of, you know, students throwing rocks at riot police or whatever. You know, and then those conditions in which the students and the workers had, you know, were acting against the regime, that put the regime on the defensive, and at that moment, the Sandinista guerrillas rose, the urban guerrillas rose, and struck a blow to the regime, a military blow to the regime, and brought it down, right? And that was the collapse of the Somoza dictatorship, and then the Sandinistas took power, you know. So yeah, unfortunately now the Sandinista revolution has completely. I mean, what the tragic fact is, you know, that the Sandinista revolution has completely degenerated now. So yeah, you know, Daniel Ortega is now in 2022, you know, a figure hated in Nicaraguan society. People want to overthrow him, you know. It's a horrible regime, very similar to the Maduro regime in Venezuela, where Ortega betrayed the Sandinista revolution, the aspirations of the Sandinista revolution, and created a personalistic dictatorship, not that much different from that of Somoza. So, yeah. Okay, I have to leave it there in this video because I'm going on 43 minutes. There will be a second part to this video shortly. Bye-bye.